A diesel engine does not die with a dramatic roar. It dies with a quiet, wet, choking cough, leaving a human being trapped inside an aluminum box at 20 below zero, while the rest of the world assumes you are merely taking a nap. When the sun began to slip behind the low hills of the Texas and Oklahoma border on that mid-February afternoon, nobody on Interstate 35 believed the weather forecast. The temperature at 2 o'clock had been a pleasant, breezy 55 degrees Fahrenheit, the kind of mild southern winter afternoon that tricks you into leaving your heavy coat rolled up in the back of the sleeper berth. But if you had spent 34 years hauling freight across the northern tier of the United States, from the iron ranges of Minnesota to the wind-scoured tundras of North Dakota, you knew that a sky turning the color of a bruised lead pipe meant only one thing. An unprecedented polar vortex was plunging south out of the Canadian Northwest, dropping like an anvil onto a state whose infrastructure was completely unprepared for Arctic reality. Arthur Pendelton parked his 1999 Peterbilt 379 near the far edge of the Texas Travel Plaza, just 10 miles south of the Red River. Arthur was 58 years old, with silver hair cropped short beneath a worn canvas cap and hands that bore the thick, permanent calluses of a man who had chained tires in knee-deep slush more times than he cared to remember. Over 3 million accident-free miles had taught Arthur a fundamental truth that younger drivers often overlooked. The road does not care about your schedule, your freight contract, or your pride, and when nature decides to shut down the highway, your truck is either your fortress or your coffin, depending entirely on the choices you made before the first snowflake touched the windshield. Within 2 short hours, the sky completely collapsed. The breeze that had been blowing gently from the south suddenly whipped around to the northwest, screaming across the flat, open plains at 40 miles per hour, and carrying a wall of freezing rain that turned into jagged sleet within minutes. The thermometer mounted on Arthur's side mirror plunged like a stone dropping down a well. 55 degrees became 32. 32 became 18. By 5 o'clock, as state troopers began pulling sawhorses across the highway ramps to close Interstate 35 inches, both directions, the temperature had slammed down into the single digits with a howling wind chill that made the air feel closer to 18 below zero. All around Arthur's spot in the parking lot, the sprawling truck stop was filling to absolute capacity. More than 150 massive 18-wheelers were wedged bumper to bumper in neat, glittering rows, their marker lights glowing yellow and red against the thickening whiteout. Inside the brightly lit truck stop diner, Southern drivers who were running coast-to-coast routes in light jackets were laughing and ordering hot coffee, treating the sudden closure like an unexpected holiday. They talked loudly about how the Texas sun would come out by tomorrow afternoon, melt the ice, and have them back on the road toward Dallas before their delivery windows expired. Arthur sat quietly in his driver's seat, watching the chaos unfold through his heated side mirrors. He did not join the laughter inside the diner, nor did he rush to buy souvenir hats or lottery tickets. Instead, he pulled on his heavy wool gloves, stepped out into the biting wind, and began his pre-storm routine with the calm, deliberate focus of a ship captain preparing for a hurricane. He walked around his rig, checking his tires, inspecting his airlines, and watching the way the wind was scouring under the bellies of the parked trucks. He saw young drivers leaving their cab windows cracked to run power cords, parking directly over open drain grates where cold air rushed upward like a chimney in reverse, and filling their fuel tanks with untreated local Texas diesel that had never seen a drop of anti-gel additive in its life. Arthur shook his head slowly. The storm was coming, the temperature was crashing, and 90% of the men parked in this lot were walking directly into a trap from which their high-tech machinery would not be able to save them. While the younger drivers crowded around the television screens inside the warm travel plaza, Arthur Pendelton was doing something on the asphalt that made every person who walked past stop and stare. From his side toolboxes, Arthur pulled out 4 thick, custom-cut heavy rubber snow flaps, the kind normally mounted behind rear-drive tires, and began strapping them securely along the lower frame rails of his truck, effectively building an airtight skirt that sealed the gap between the bottom of his cab and the frozen ground. To an untrained observer, it looked absurd. It looked as though an old man had decided to dress his semi-truck in an oversized rubber dress. But Arthur knew the physics of cold weather survival better than any automotive engineer in Detroit. When 40-mile-per-hour winds blow across a flat parking lot, they hit the front bumper of a truck and accelerate beneath the frame rails, creating a high-velocity air tunnel directly under the floorboards. That rushing air acts like a thermal vacuum, stripping heat out of the cab's thin metal floor panel 10 times faster than air moving over the insulated roof. By dropping heavy rubber skirts to the pavement, Arthur eliminated that under-rig wind scour, creating a pocket of dead, trapped air beneath his cab that acted as a massive buffer zone. Inside his sleeper berth, Arthur's preparation was even more unconventional. He had removed the factory-installed curtains years ago, replacing them with a custom double-curtain thermal airlock made of thick, quilted moving blankets, lined with reflective radiant foil. The first curtain sealed off the large, uninsulated glass windshield and steering compartment entirely, confining his living space strictly to the smaller 4x8-foot sleeper box. Beneath his mattress lay a 2-inch layer of high-density reflective insulation, paired with dense compressed wool felt, preventing the cold steel of the frame rails from leaching warmth through his bedding. Finally, before the temperature dropped below 15 degrees, Arthur poured 2 full bottles of concentrated anti-gel additive directly into his fuel tanks, mixing it thoroughly as he topped off his diesel to prevent the liquid from turning into solid paraffin wax. As Arthur was tightening the final ratchet strap on his rubber windskirt, a loud, metallic laugh echoed through the swirling snow. A brand-new chrome-plated 2024 luxury sleeper rig had pulled up in the space directly adjacent to Arthur's older Peterbilt. The door swung open, and out stepped Caleb Thorne. Caleb was 26 years old, wore a thin designer hoodie, pristine leather boots, and carried himself with the supreme, unearned confidence of someone who had never had to restart a gel diesel engine at 2 in the morning. Caleb was a lease purchase driver running high-value electronics down from Chicago, and his rig was equipped with every digital amenity money could buy: massive touchscreens, factory-heated leather seats, and a high-horsepower engine that purred with smooth, computerized perfection. Caleb stood on his running board, leaning against his polished door frame as he watched Arthur pull his thick rubber skirts tight against the freezing pavement. Caleb laughed again, shaking his head with open amusement at what he clearly considered an embarrassing display of old-timer paranoia. He called out across the howling wind, asking Arthur if he was planning to wrap the truck in bubble wrap next, or if he was just building a rubber fort because he was scared of a little Texas frost. He boasted loudly about his brand-new truck, claiming that modern engineering had made all those prehistoric northern tricks obsolete. With a digital thermostat inside his cab and 70 gallons of fuel in his tanks, Caleb claimed he could idle his main engine for days in total luxury, while Arthur huddled inside his ugly rubber-skirted tin can. Arthur finished tightening his ratchet strap, wiped the frost from his eyebrows, and turned to look at the young man. His voice was calm, measured, and entirely devoid of anger. He told Caleb that modern electronics do not generate heat when the fuel inside the lines turns to jelly, and that an aluminum cab loses its warmth the second the main engine stops turning. He gently advised Caleb to go inside, buy a bottle of fuel treatment before the store closed, and pour it into his tanks before the temperature dropped any lower. Caleb merely smirked, waved his hand dismissively, and told Arthur to keep his outdated advice to himself. He declared that his truck was a modern machine, not an antique, and that he intended to spend the evening watching movies on his widescreen television, with the factory heater blowing 75 degrees. With that, Caleb slammed his heavy cab door shut, leaving Arthur standing in the bitter wind. Arthur watched the young man's main engine idle high, its twin chrome exhaust stacks blowing pale white vapor into the darkening sky. Arthur said nothing more. He climbed up his own side steps, stepped into his cab, and pulled his outer door tight against the storm. If you are enjoying this story of survival and practical wisdom, please take a second to like this video and subscribe our channel to help us share more incredible historical tales. The disaster struck at precisely 3:30 in the morning, not with a sudden explosion or a dramatic thunderclap, but with the eerie, absolute silence of an entire regional infrastructure snapping under pressure. Outside, the polar vortex had reached its absolute apex. The ambient air temperature across North Texas had crashed down to 4 degrees Fahrenheit, with sustained winds of 45 miles per hour driving the wind chill down to a terrifying 18 below zero. The state's electrical grid, overwhelmed by millions of electric heaters drawing power simultaneously across a region whose generation facilities had never been weatherized for Arctic conditions, suffered a catastrophic, cascading failure. In an instant, every high-mast light tower across the 10-acre Texas Travel Plaza went completely dark. The massive neon signs hanging over the interstate died. Inside the Travel Plaza building, the registers beeped once and went silent. The commercial coffee warmers turned cold, and the automated building heating units hummed to a halt. Within 30 minutes, the main water lines running beneath the concrete floor of the truck stop froze solid and burst, flooding the main concourse with freezing water before the emergency valves could even be located. The Travel Plaza manager, realizing that he had no lights, no heat, no working toilets, and no way to process sales, was forced to evacuate the staff, lock the heavy glass doors, and leave over 300 stranded travelers and truck drivers to fend for themselves in the dark. For the drivers parked in the lot, the collapse of the plaza was a psychological shockwave. Most had assumed that if their trucks became uncomfortable, they could simply walk inside the heated building, buy hot food, use the restrooms, and sit in a warm booth until snowplows cleared the interstate. Now, looking out through their frosted side windows, they saw only an impenetrable, pitch-black void filled with screaming white snow. The truck stop was dead. The pumps were dead. The store was dead. There was no rescue coming, no tow trucks moving, and no emergency shelters operating within 50 miles. It was at this moment that a terrifying realization began to settle over the parking lot. The diesel fuel was there, sitting in massive underground tanks just 50 feet beneath their tires. Thousands upon thousands of gallons of high-grade energy were sitting right beneath the asphalt, but without electrical power to run the heavy submersible pumps inside the fuel islands. That diesel was as inaccessible as if it were on the moon. The drivers were completely on their own, trapped inside small metal boxes, isolated in a frozen desert, with whatever fuel they currently had in their tanks being the absolute limit of their survival reserves for the next 3 days. To understand the invisible battle that began taking place inside those trapped trucks at 4 in the morning, one must understand the unforgiving physics of vehicle thermodynamics. An 18-wheeler is essentially a box made of thin-sheet aluminum, structural steel, and glass, 3 materials that are among the most efficient heat conductors on the planet. Aluminum sheet metal does not hold heat. It hands it off directly to the outside air. Steel rivets act as thermal bridges, drawing warm interior energy straight through the walls and venting it into the atmosphere. When a truck is parked in an open lot during an Arctic storm, heat escapes through 3 distinct pathways working at the exact same time. Conduction pulls warmth through the metal skin and floor pan. Radiation vents infrared heat outward through the glass windshield toward the cold sky. But the most destructive force of all is convection, the physical movement of air, stripping heat away from solid surfaces. This is where the invisible killer of the parking lot came into play. Rig, convective wind scour. When a 40-mile-per-hour wind hits a flat-sided truck cab, the air that flows underneath the vehicle is squeezed into a narrow space between the oil pan, transmission, and frame rails. According to fluid dynamics, when air is squeezed into a smaller channel, its velocity increases dramatically. That high-speed air running beneath the cab creates a localized low-pressure zone that literally scours thermal energy directly out of the thin steel floorboards. While a driver might think they are safe because their cab walls are insulated, their feet are resting on a floor pan that is being continuously blasted by an Arctic wind tunnel moving at 55 miles per hour. This brought the drivers face to face with a brutal mathematical dilemma regarding how they chose to generate heat. The vast majority of drivers relied on main engine idling, leaving their 500 horsepower heavy-duty diesel engine running continuously to power the factory dashboard heater. But a heavy diesel engine is an extraordinarily inefficient furnace. At idle, a massive 15-liter engine burns between 0.8 and 1 full gallon of diesel fuel every single hour just to keep itself warm enough to operate. Over a 72-hour standstill, a driver idling his main engine will burn through 60 to 75 gallons of fuel. In a storm where no fuel pumps are working, burning 70 gallons of fuel just to stay warm is an act of mathematical suicide. Furthermore, main engine idling carries a hidden structural danger in sub-zero weather. When a large diesel engine idles for long periods in extreme cold, it cannot maintain its optimal operating temperature. The cylinder walls cool down, causing incomplete combustion, a condition mechanics call wet stacking. Unburned fuel coats the cylinder walls, washes away protective oil, and clogs the exhaust filters with thick black soot, eventually causing the engine to knock, lose oil pressure, and shut itself down automatically to prevent total mechanical destruction. Conversely, a driver equipped with a dedicated auxiliary power unit, a tiny 2-cylinder generator mounted on the frame rail or a diesel-fired bunk heater, operates under a completely different physical law. A bunk heater is a device no larger than a shoebox that draws fuel directly from the main tank and burns it inside a sealed ceramic combustion chamber. It consumes a mere 0.12 gallons of fuel per hour, less than 1/8 of what the main engine burns. It delivers pure, dry, radiant heat directly into the sleeper berth without requiring the massive main engine to turn over a single time. Behind all of this lay the silent chemical threat that was actively ticking away inside every fuel tank on the lot: paraffin wax crystallization. Number 2. Diesel fuel. The standard fuel sold across North America contains naturally occurring dissolved paraffin wax. In warm weather, this wax remains liquid and invisible, providing essential lubrication for fuel injectors. But as the temperature of the fuel falls toward 20 degrees Fahrenheit, it reaches its cloud point, where the wax begins to separate from the liquid and form microscopic, floating crystals. If the temperature drops further, to around 5 degrees Fahrenheit, the cold filter plugging point, those wax crystals multiply exponentially, clumping together into a thick, yellowish sludge that completely coats the microscopic pores of the fuel filter. The moment a fuel filter becomes plugged with wax, the engine is starved of fuel. It stutters, loses power, and dies. Southern Fuel Stops in Texas, operating in what was normally a temperate climate, sold summer blend diesel fuel that had a cloud point of 20 degrees and had never been treated with anti-gel chemicals. The moment the polar vortex plunged the plaza to 4 degrees, every drop of fuel sitting in those untreated tanks turned into a thick, waxy jar of petroleum jelly. By 8 o'clock on the first morning of the blizzard, the parking lot of the Texas Travel Plaza had turned into a whiteout graveyard. Horizontal snow was blowing so hard that drivers looking out their side windows could not see the taillights of the trucks parked 20 feet beside them. Snowdrifts 3 feet deep had already formed against the windward sides of the trailers, burying fuel tanks and tires in dense, wind-packed banks. Inside his shiny 2024 sleeper rig, Caleb Thorne was beginning his day with an uneasy sense of frustration. His main engine had been idling high all night, keeping his factory dashboard heater blowing warm air. Caleb had spent the evening watching movies on his tablet, confident that his modern truck was handling the weather with ease. But around 9 in the morning, Caleb noticed a subtle, worrying change in the sound of his engine. The smooth, powerful thrum of his heavy diesel began to acquire an irregular, metallic pitch. The engine RPM fluctuated wildly, dropping from 900 down to 500, then surging back up with a raspy, choking sound. Caleb frowned, putting down his coffee cup and looking at his digital dashboard. A series of bright yellow warning icons suddenly flashed across his main screen. Fuel pressure low, followed immediately by engine emissions fault, and finally a flashing red warning: stop engine soon. Panic surged through Caleb's chest. He tapped the touchscreens, tried to manually raise the engine idle, but the electronic controls refused his commands. The main engine gave 3 heavy shuddering gasps, spat a thick cloud of gray smoke from the exhaust stacks, and died completely. Silence, absolute, suffocating silence, filled the cab. Within seconds, The roaring warmth that had been blowing from the dashboard vents ceased, replaced by a thin, icy draft of Arctic air leaking through the steering column. Caleb reached for the ignition key and turned it. The starter motor engaged with a heavy, grinding groan, turning the engine over slowly, but the diesel refused to catch. Caleb tried again, holding the key down for 10 seconds, then 15. Every time he cranked the starter, his primary 12-volt batteries drained further under the immense load of turning over a frozen engine filled with thick, cold oil. What Caleb did not understand was that his untreated Texas diesel had reached its filter plugging point hours ago. The paraffin wax had completely encased his fuel filters in a solid block of yellow sludge. No matter how many times he cranked the starter, not a single drop of liquid fuel could reach his engine cylinders. On his fifth attempt, the starter motor gave a faint, clicking chirp, the digital dashboard flickered twice, and went completely dark. His main batteries were dead. 2 spaces over, inside the quiet sanctuary of Arthur Pendelton's Peterbilt, the scene was entirely different. Arthur's main engine was completely off, cold and resting quietly beneath its insulated fiberglass hood. But inside his sleeper berth, it was a warm, comfortable 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Arthur's tiny diesel bunk heater was humming with a low, rhythmic purr, drawing a tiny trickle of anti-gel-treated fuel from his tanks and converting it into steady, dry, radiant heat. Arthur's custom double-curtain thermal airlock was doing its job flawlessly. The front driving cab was cold, but the small insulated sleeper compartment retained warmth like a thermos bottle. Arthur sat on his neatly made bed in his flannel shirt, sipping a cup of hot black tea he had brewed on a tiny, self-contained butane camping stove. He listened to the storm raging outside, checked his battery voltage meter, which sat at a healthy 13.2 volts, thanks to his small solar trickle charger mounted on the roof, and quietly logged his morning observations in his notebook. He was warm, he was fed, and his equipment was completely unharmed. By the second day of the standstill, the situation across the Travel Plaza parking lot had transformed from an inconvenient delay into a full-scale humanitarian crisis. The temperature refused to climb, staying locked at 2 degrees above zero, while the wind continued to howl across the open plains at 35 miles per hour. Across the lot, more than 40 trucks had suffered the exact same fate as Caleb's. Their untreated fuel had gelled in the lines, their main engines had starved and died, and their drivers, attempting to restart them, had completely drained their battery banks. Without power, without heat, and with no way to enter the locked, flooded Travel Plaza building, drivers were trapped inside aluminum boxes that were rapidly cooling down to match the freezing environment outside. Inside these cold cabs, a secondary physical nightmare was unfolding. Interior condensation ice. A resting human being exhales roughly 200 milliliters of water vapor every 8 hours through normal respiration. In a sealed, unheated truck cab, that moisture rises, hits the cold, uninsulated metal roof and glass windshield, and instantly freezes into a jagged layer of white interior frost. Within 12 hours of an engine dying, the inside surfaces of a cab become coated in a quarter-inch layer of ice. As the driver shivers under whatever light blankets they possess, their body heat melts a tiny fraction of that frost, turning their bedding damp and clammy. Damp clothing and sub-zero temperatures lead directly to rapid, severe hypothermia. Around 3 o'clock on the second afternoon, Arthur Pendelton pulled on his heavy winter parka, pulled his wool face mask tight, and stepped out into the knee-deep snowdrifts to check on his neighbors. He moved methodically from truck to truck, tapping heavily on sleeper doors with the wooden handle of his tire iron. At the third truck down, Arthur found Bobby Hayes, a 21-year-old rookie driver from Alabama who was on his first solo cross-country trip. Bobby's engine had gelled the previous night, his batteries were dead, and the boy was curled in a tight ball on his mattress, wrapped in a single thin fleece blanket, shivering so violently that he could barely articulate his own name. The inside of Bobby's windshield was coated in thick ice, and the air inside his cab had dropped to 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Arthur did not hesitate. He reached up, grabbed the boy by his shoulders, and hauled him out of his frozen cab. He guided the stumbling, shivering rookie across the treacherous asphalt, helped him climb up the side steps of his Peterbilt, and pushed him through the double-curtain thermal airlock into the warm sleeper berth. The effect on the young driver was immediate. As Bobby stepped into the 66-degree air inside Arthur's sleeper berth, the warmth hit his frozen face, and he collapsed onto Arthur's bench seat, sobbing with a mixture of intense physical relief and sheer exhaustion. Arthur wrapped the boy in a dry wool blanket, poured him a mug of steaming beef broth from his thermal flask, and sat him near the floor vent where the dry, warm air was blowing. Arthur spent the next 4 hours walking the lot, checking on other stranded drivers, offering extra anti-gel treatment to those whose engines were still running, and distributing spare wool socks and warm water to those who were stuck. But when Arthur approached Caleb Thorne's shiny truck, he saw that Caleb's window was completely covered in thick interior frost. Arthur knocked heavily on the chrome door handle, calling out to ask if the young man was all right. Inside the frozen cab, Caleb heard the knock. He was sitting on his bed, wrapped in 3 thin nylon jackets, his fingers completely numb, his toes throbbing with a dull, sickening ache, and his breath forming thick white clouds in the dark. His cab temperature had dropped to 22 degrees. Pride-stubborn, arrogant youth pride swelled up in Caleb's throat. He remembered how he had mocked Arthur's rubber skirts, how he had laughed at the old man's warnings, and how he had bragged about his modern luxury machine. Caleb bit his lip, squeezed his eyes shut, and remained silent in the dark, refusing to answer the knock. He listened as Arthur's heavy footsteps retreated into the snow, telling himself that he could make it through one more night on his own. It was a mistake that very nearly cost Caleb Thorne his life. By 2 o'clock on the morning of the 3rd day, the storm had reached a level of violence that terrified even the most hardened northern veterans. The wind chill had dropped to a lethal 20 below zero, and 45-mile-per-hour gusts were rocking the massive, 70,000-pound tractor trailers like toy boats in a bathtub. Inside his dead rig, Caleb Thorne was dying. He had passed beyond the stage of violent shivering into the dangerous, quiet lethargy that marks the onset of secondary hypothermia. His body temperature had dropped below 94 degrees. His hands were stiff, pale blocks of wood that could no longer grip a zipper or operate his dead cell phone. The interior of his luxury sleeper cab had become an ice cave. His breath had frozen thick across the ceiling, and tiny flakes of frost were drifting down onto his face every time a wind gust slammed against the outer aluminum skin. Caleb's mind was hazy, confused, floating in a dangerous, dreamy fog where stopping the effort to stay warm felt like the most peaceful choice he could make. Through a small patch of clear glass he had scraped with a fingernail hours earlier, Caleb looked out into the black storm. Just 15 feet away sat Arthur Pendelton's Peterbilt. Caleb watched the dark silhouette of Arthur's truck. The main engine was completely dark and silent, as it had been for 3 days. But coming from the small stainless steel exhaust port of Arthur's bunk heater, located low on the side sleeper panel, was a thin, steady, perfectly uniform wisp of dry white vapor. That tiny wisp of vapor was the only sign of life in the entire dark quadrant of the parking lot. Caleb looked at his own blue, swollen fingers. He thought about his mother back in Indiana. He thought about his career, his pride, and the sheer terrifying foolishness that had made him dismiss an old man's wisdom because it came wrapped in ugly rubber skirts. Caleb realized with terrifying clarity that if he stayed in this bed for another 2 hours, he would not wake up in the morning. Caleb forced his frozen legs to move. He swung his feet off the mattress, his boots striking the ice-coated floorboards with a dull, hollow thud. He could not feel his toes at all. He fumbled with the door latch, using his wrists because his fingers would not bend, and shoved the heavy cab door open against the screaming wind. The Arctic air hit Caleb like a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs. He tumbled off the running board, landing on his knees in a 3-foot snowdrift between the 2 trucks. The wind howled through his thin hoodie, biting straight to his ribs. Caleb scrambled through the snow on his hands and knees, clawing his way up the side steps of Arthur's Peterbilt. He raised his stiff, frozen fist and pounded on the sleeper door with everything he had left in his body. The sound was faint against the roar of the blizzard, but inside the cab, Arthur Pendelton heard it. Arthur swung his legs off his bed, grabbed his tire iron for security, and unlatched the outer sleeper door. The door swung open, and the freezing wind blew in, carrying with it the collapsed, shivering form of Caleb Thorne. Arthur immediately reached down, grabbed Caleb by his jacket collar, and hauled the young man inside, pulling the heavy door shut and latching it tight. He unzipped the double-curtained thermal airlock, guided Caleb through the baffle, and pushed him into the sleeper berth. The transition was so extreme that Caleb's senses completely buckled. He stepped out of an 18 below zero Arctic tempest into a bone-dry, glowing sanctuary that felt like a midsummer afternoon. Arthur was standing in his sleeper berth, wearing a short-sleeved flannel shirt and light cotton trousers. The air inside the small compartment was thick with the rich, savory aroma of simmering vegetable soup. The walls were completely dry. The air was warm and still, and the small bunk heater vent near the floor was releasing a steady, quiet stream of pure heat. Caleb collapsed onto the lower bunk beside young Bobby Hayes, who was fast asleep under a clean blanket. Arthur immediately wrapped Caleb in a heavy wool horse blanket, stripped off the young man's frozen boots and wet socks, and began rubbing Caleb's pale, lifeless feet with a dry towel to restore circulation. As the blood began to flow back into Caleb's extremities, a process that brought agonizing, burning pain that made the young man clench his teeth, Caleb's eyes wandered around the small sleeper cabin in utter disbelief. He looked at the wall-mounted analog thermometer hanging beside Arthur's reading lamp. The red spirit column sat cleanly, steadily, and undeniably at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, the storm was raging at 18 below zero. Inside Arthur's cab, it was 68 above. A temperature differential of 86 degrees Fahrenheit, maintained in the middle of a grid collapse without running the main engine a single time. Caleb stared at the ledger, reading the side-by-side numbers that Arthur had written down in his open logbook. Caleb's main engine idling method burned nearly a gallon of fuel every hour when running, while Arthur's compact bunk heater and auxiliary hybrid burned a tiny 0.12 of a gallon per hour. Over 3 days, Caleb had burned 52 gallons before his engine gelled up and died, whereas Arthur had burned less than 9 gallons total. Inside Caleb's rig, the temperature had plummeted to 22 degrees, with ice forming on the walls, while Arthur's cab sat at a comfortable, bone-dry 68 degrees. Caleb was facing over $1,500 in wasted fuel and towing bills, while Arthur's total fuel cost was just $32. And while Caleb's battery bank was completely drained, Arthur's battery system remained fully charged at 13.2 volts. Caleb stared at the ledger for a long, silent minute. He looked at the total fuel burned. Arthur had used less than 9 gallons of diesel over 3 full days of extreme storm, while Caleb had burned 50. 2 gallons before his engine gelled and died, leaving him with a ruined truck, dead batteries, and a $3,000 repair bill waiting for him when the roads thawed. Tears welled up in Caleb's eyes, not from the physical pain in his thawing feet, but from a deep, overwhelming wave of shame and gratitude. He looked up at Arthur, his voice trembling as he spoke. He apologized for calling Arthur's truck an ugly rubber fort. He apologized for laughing at the old man's warnings, for his arrogance, and for thinking that a shiny paint job and a digital dashboard made him superior to 34 years of hard-won wisdom. Arthur sat down on the edge of the opposite berth, handed Caleb a steaming mug of hot soup, and smiled with quiet, fatherly warmth. Arthur told the young man that the road is a stern teacher, but it is not a cruel one if you are willing to learn the lesson. He explained that nature does not care about shiny chrome, high-horsepower engines, or how much money a man spent on his truck. The open road respects only physics, preparation, and the humility to realize that humans are fragile creatures who must respect the elements if they want to survive. Arthur told Caleb that there was no shame in being young and foolish, but there was great danger in staying that way. He assured Caleb that he was safe, that his feet would recover, and that when the sun came up, they would fix his truck together. On the morning of the 4th day, the Arctic polar vortex finally broke its grip on the southern plains. The howling wind died down to a gentle breeze, and a brilliant, blinding winter sun rose into a clear, pale blue Texas sky, reflecting off a landscape transformed into a vast ocean of glittering white snow. Around 9 in the morning, The deep, rhythmic rumble of heavy Vate engines echoed down Interstate 35 as a convoy of massive state snowplows and salt trucks cut the first open lane through the frozen highway. Shortly after, emergency power restoration crews reached the travel plaza, bringing portable industrial generators to hook up to the main station, bringing the plaza lights back to life for the first time in 80 hours. Arthur Pendelton did not waste a second. He pulled on his work boots, stepped out into the crisp morning air, and immediately began helping his neighbors. Arthur pulled a heavy 40-foot tow strap from his side box, along with a portable kerosene heat torpedo he kept in his trailer. He set up the heat torpedo beneath Caleb's frozen chassis, wrapping a heavy canvas tarp around the bottom of Caleb's engine bay to trap the hot air. For 2 hours, Arthur and Caleb worked side by side in the snow. Arthur showed Caleb how to remove a gelled fuel filter, how to fill a fresh filter with clean diesel mixed with anti-gel fluid, and how to use a hand primer pump to bleed air out of the fuel lines. As the heat torpedo thawed the engine block and liquefied the paraffin wax inside the lines, Arthur hooked heavy jumper cables from his own fully charged Peterbilt battery bank to Caleb's dead starters. Caleb climbed up into his cab, turned the key, and after 3 strong cranks, the high-horsepower engine roared back to life, blowing a dark cloud of soot into the morning air before settling into a smooth, powerful thrum. Caleb jumped down from his cab, his face beaming with excitement, and shook Arthur's hand with profound respect. Over the next 3 hours, Arthur and Caleb moved through the lot together, helping Bobby Hayes and 4 other young drivers degel their fuel lines, jump-start their dead batteries, and get their trucks running safely. The young drivers who had previously viewed Arthur as an outdated relic now followed him around the lot like students following a master craftsman, hanging on to every word of advice he gave about fuel management, thermal airlocks, and under-rig wind protection. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the state police officially reopened Interstate 35 for commercial traffic. One by one, the long line of tractor-trailers began pulling out of the Texas Travel Plaza, their tires crunching heavily over the salted snow as they lined up on the entrance ramp to resume their journeys across the country. Arthur Pendelton climbed up into his Peterbilt, pulled his heavy rubber windskirts back into his side toolbox, and unlatched his double-curtain thermal airlock. His truck started on the very first turn of the key, its engine humming smoothly, its air tanks building pressure, and its trailer loaded with 40,000 pounds of fresh food bound for grocery store shelves in Oklahoma that had been emptied during the storm. Looking in his side mirror, Arthur saw Caleb Thorne's shiny rig pulling into line directly behind him, maintaining a safe, respectful distance, no longer a cocky, arrogant rival, but a dedicated brother of the road who had learned what it truly meant to be a professional driver. The true measure of a truck driver is never found in the horsepower beneath their hood, the polish on their chrome, or the digital screens lining their dashboard, but in the quiet depth of their preparation and their willingness to protect others when the world goes dark. Arthur Pendelton did not merely survive 3 days trapped in an Arctic blizzard. He carried a roomful of warmth, human dignity, and life-saving knowledge through a storm that paralyzed an entire state. As the long convoy of 18-wheelers rolled north onto the open asphalt of Interstate 35, the unspoken bond among the drivers in that line was permanently transformed. Caleb Thorne would never again pass an older rig without a feeling of deep respect, nor would he ever set out onto the open highway without remembering the old man who had saved his life with a pair of rubber snow flaps and an analog thermometer. In a modern world that continually assumes technology will solve every problem and that the electrical grid will never fail, the story of those 3 days stands as an enduring beacon of truth. True survival is not about complexity, wealth, or modern luxury. It is about knowledge, humility, and the quiet human spirit that refuses to let the cold win. If you found value, warmth, and inspiration in this story of survival and traditional wisdom, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe our channel. By subscribing, you help us bring more incredible stories of human resilience, forgotten historical techniques, and the unsung heroes of the open road directly to your feed. We would love to hear your thoughts on Arthur's ingenuity and Caleb's transformation. What is the coldest weather you have ever survived? And what traditional survival techniques do you swear by when the power goes out? Drop your story in the comments below. We read every single one. Thank you for watching. Drive safely out there, respect the weather, and we will see you in the next story.